Good afternoon, everybody, and Happy New Year's. Really great to welcome you back to the Cyber Center speaker series. My name is Jeff Hancock. I'm the co-director of the center, along with my good colleague over there, Nate Priscilli. Today, I'm really thrilled to introduce you to somebody that really sits at the core center of thinking around policy and academia. He does a lot of work as a researcher, but also as a technologist and as a policy person. And in fact, has had a number of things, in particular Minnesota, where it's bringing some of his ideas into actual law around social media. So Ravi Iyer is the managing director of the Neely Center at USC. He is managing a number of huge research projects there, but also thinking about design, how to improve social media, not just by removing things that are bad, but enhancing things that are good. Before that, he was at Meta. Before that, he was doing some startups. And before that, he worked with John Haidt on a whole bunch of stuff around moral psychology. So he comes from an academic background, but has been working in technology since. So please join me in welcoming Ravi. Thanks, Ravi.
All right, everyone. Thank you for having me. Again, I'm Ravi Iyer. I guess I don't have to introduce myself because Jeff did such a nice job. Today I'm going to talk about measurably improving online experiences by design. And I have like a very simple set of things that I wanted to communicate today. Maybe overly simple. Basically that, there is a problem with online platforms, that it's a fixable problem and it's a measurable problem. And this may seem like overly simplistic, and I'll get into the details of it, but I think it's meant to be somewhat in contrast to the idea that, and it's not that I don't think we need to do more research, right? But that, many people do an academic talk, and the end of the talk is like, everything is complex and we need to do more research. And of course we need to do more research. We don't know everything, but we know some things. And so I think we can actually make progress on the things that we know. We can fix them and we can make measurable progress. And so hopefully we can do that even as we also continue to do more research by the people in this room. So, and hopefully also by being simple, I won't blend together with all the many talks that you hear this month. So what is the specific problem with online platforms? So I'm not going to talk about does social media cause polarization? I'm not going to talk about does social media cause mental health problems. I'm going to be a lot more specific. I'm going to say the problem statement is that specific platform designs cause polarizing and mentally disturbing experiences for many people. So not for everyone, but for a unacceptably large number of people. And this problem is fixable largely through design, not through the content moderation processes that we often reach for solving these problems. And I'll give you some examples of why. And if we fix this problem, it will be measurable. We will be able to measurably see that we have fixed this problem. So that's the goal of what I'm going to communicate today. I welcome feedback. I welcome challenges in the Q&A, and hopefully we can have a productive discussion. So why do I focus on this sort of more narrow problem statement? Well, I think focusing on discrete design decisions, focusing on discrete design decisions makes the problem a lot more tractable. So, if you're trying to fix our relationship with, say, Facebook, and so you have a user who's getting unwanted sexual content on Reels. It doesn't really matter to them that, there's another person over there on Groups who's connecting with people, and so their experience is helping their mental health. You're having like a disturbing experience over here. You can fix this disturbing experience without, the fact that there are other people over there on Groups connecting with each other doesn't really have anything to do with your Reels experience where potentially you're getting sexual content that you're not ready for or you didn't ask for. So focusing on discrete design decisions allows you to fix problems in a much more discrete way and a lot more tractable way. There are jurisdictions around the world that are focusing on these things in more global ways, like should kids be allowed to use social media at all? But even in those jurisdictions, they're having problems figuring out what actually counts as social media and what doesn't, right? So in Australia, for example, they're creating limits for kids as far as what social media projects, as far as their usage of social media products. But there's a question about whether a product like YouTube actually counts as social media. To some degree it does because it has an engagement-based feed, you can upload content to it. But a lot of the people who access YouTube are really using it more like Netflix, right? They're accessing it in a logged out state. they're watching sports highlights, they're watching, content, and they're not necessarily like using it in the same way that they use other social media products. There are people who think that, that social media laws should apply to video game platforms, right? So video game platforms have a lot of the same aspects of social media. You can contact strangers on video game platforms often, but they don't have user-generated content. So a lot of every platform has a different mix of these design affordances. Some platforms have user-generated content. Some platforms have engagement-based feeds. Some platforms have the ability to contact strangers. And when you tackle things at the design level, you actually can understand how we should design each of these features best, and you can apply those design decisions to those feeds wherever they may exist, right? So if we have design principles for how people should be able to contact strangers, they can apply to every kind of platform where people are contacting strangers, not just the ones that we define as, quote, social media. So I think it makes it more tractable to focus on specific design decisions. And then the second thing that, in my problem statement that designs are causing polarizing and mentally disturbing experiences is not focusing on variables like depression or anxiety or polarization, but instead focusing on the experiences that people are reporting themselves. And so I'll use Meta's Beef survey as an example of this. This is a survey that's run by Instagram. It's a representative sample of Instagram users. Recently became public through one of the court cases. And effectively, it asks Instagram users in the last 7 days, have you had any of these experiences? So in the last 7 days, have you ever seen nudity or sexual images on Instagram that you didn't want to see, right? That's the nudity question. And if you go here onto the right, you can see that 19.2% of 13 to 15-year-olds at this period of time, right? And so this is, a few years old, but at least in one snapshot that we have from internal platform research, 19% of 13 to 15-year-olds in a 7-day period saw sexual content that they didn't want to see. They actually were, it's not something they were looking for example. And so, if roughly half of youth are on Instagram and 19% of those youth in a 7-day period are seeing unwanted sexual content, that's actually a large number of youth, right? And for comparison, it's 6.2% of 45 plus users. I don't have not to pick on Instagram, I don't have the numbers for TikTok or for Snapchat, but it's a fairly large number of youth who are having these experiences. And I would argue that these experiences are worth addressing regardless of whether it has a subsequent impact on their mental health, right? Like it's good for us, and the average age of pornography exposure in the United States in one study was age 12, and so a lot of kids are getting access to sexual content early, and there are lots of reasons to believe that these experiences will eventually have an impact on their mental health. But whether it does or it doesn't, there is value to just removing these kinds of unwanted experiences from people's lives. Some of the other questions here are about, have you ever felt worse about yourself because of other people's posts on Instagram? 21% of 13 to 15-year-olds report feeling worse about themselves in a 7-day period, right? So, almost 11% report being a target of bullying in a 7-day period, right? So these are, fairly large numbers of people reporting negative experiences with these platforms. And these are experiences that I think most people in this room would argue would agree are worth addressing regardless of the subsequent impact on mental health outcomes. The second reason to focus on negative experiences is because they're more sensitive. And so I'm going to use two studies here that sort of come to contrasting conclusions about online platforms' experiences or effects on divisiveness to illustrate the point. So on the left, this is a study led by Smith and Milley. It compares the engagement-based feed on Twitter to the chronological-based feed. And basically, it shows that people who have the engagement-based feed report seeing more tweets that make them feel worse about people on the other side. And they basically ask people to evaluate, how the content is making them feel, right? So they're basically saying, content-wise, I'm seeing a lot of divisive content that I think is causing me to have negative experiences about the other side. On the right, this is, and so in that paper, they conclude that, yes, engagement-based feeds have an impact on divisiveness. On the right, this is a paper from the Facebook 2020 studies. Effectively, they're changing the feed. You have an A test, one kind of feed in one condition. You have a different kind of feed in another condition, and you're seeing that there is an effect on people's actual attitudes. So if you in condition A, people's attitudes towards the other party are the same as in condition B. There is no statistical difference there. In both studies, they agree, they acknowledge that platforms have a big effect on content, but the conclusions are different because in one study, the dependent variable is people's judgments of the content, and then in the other study, it's the attitudinal variable of their affective feelings towards the other party. I think both of these studies can be completely true, right? Like I think that people can be right that these things are making them feel worse about the other party, even as in a relatively short-term study on one platform, you're not actually seeing an effect on people's attitudes towards the other group. And here's an example of just like some of the more popular more popular kinds of content on these platforms. You guys are seeing it. You're probably not experiencing an increase in polarization yourselves. And that's probably because you live in a world where like this kind of content is actually fairly commonplace. Even if you change someone's experience on Facebook in some experiment, they still live in a world where the politicians and the publishers on every other platform on cable TV, they're still being incentivized to produce divisive content. And so when I worked at Meta, one thing that made me believe that we had a problem was the fact that people would tell us or say in the media that they were producing divisive content, not because they wanted to, but because it did well in our algorithm. And so Facebook, there's a Wall Street Journal article you can read where BuzzFeed came to Meta and said specifically they're producing divisive content because of the algorithm that Meta had. There are many political parties who say similar things. They say, quote, there's a structural incentive to engage in attack politics. And so when you have a test where you change one part of an algorithm and you still live in a world where there's this broader incentive to be more divisive. And though that broader incentive, that ecosystem level incentive to be more divisive, is shaped by individual platform design decisions. So there are many experiments that have since become public at platforms, from platforms where they show that changing the algorithm, removing certain predictions. So for example, removing the prediction of what kinds of content get more comments or predictions of what kind of content get more shares, actually leads to improvements in outcomes. So you actually see, if you remove comment and share predictions, in this Wall Street Journal article, users told Facebook that their feeds were more worth their time, anger reactions fall, you get less bullying, you get less misinformation, you get less graphic violence, right? And if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, right? Like, if you guys, so a reshare is kind of like a forward. So like, I don't know if you guys remember like back in the day when you used to get these emails that were like forwarded, like forward, 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 forward. Like those were never good emails, right? Like those were always like crappy pieces of content, right? So something that's like forwarded like 7 times is generally like, it could be a chain letter, could be something like, be careful about this health issue, right? Like it's not something that necessarily is high quality content. Similarly, like things that get lots of comments are not necessarily high quality content. If I give you medical advice, if your doctor gives you medical advice and you're discussing it a lot, like usually good medical advice, you just sort of take, it's kind of meant to be boring. If I said something like, red wine will help you live to 120, right? Like that's the kind of thing we could discuss. We could discuss it because it's kind of controversial. It's kind of sensational, right? So having these kinds of incentives, we want forwarded things and we want things that people comment a lot on, naturally make and measurably make these ecosystems worse. And so these are the ways that platforms are sort of shaping ecosystems in ways that, that by design, that we can fix. Okay, so I'm arguing, and so that's an argument as far as divisiveness. The same also applies for kids' outcomes as well, right? So there's an incentive to be divisive, there's an incentive to be sensational, there's an incentive to be more sexual, there's an incentive to be more extreme, and all of these are things you can sort of see in these platform experiments. I think this problem is fixable by design, right? People made a decision to optimize for comments and shares. They can unmake that decision to optimize for comments and shares. They can optimize for something else. And I'll tell you a little bit my journey to design just as a way of illustrating that this problem is fixable. So I actually started off at Meta as a data science manager in newsfeed integrity. My job was actually, it's kind of like being an accountant. So we counted how many times people saw content that was later taken down for hate speech or bullying. We would drive those numbers down to fairly low levels, the levels that are often reported to people in society. But oftentimes we weren't actually fixing the problem. So we'd still get these reports, and you see these today, where people are saying like, look, it's really easy to find content that we feel is harmful. And even though you're telling us that this is a rare experience, it's actually a very common experience for us. And so I actually joined the research team, and so where I could ask people, like, what are the experiences that you feel are harmful? We could try to close those gaps between what the platform believes is violating and what users think is harmful. We worked a lot on closing those gaps, but there's no way to fully define all the ways that users are misleading each other or that users are harming each other. And so eventually I moved into product management, where we worked on these kinds of design decisions. And just to give you an example of the kinds of content that users say are harmful, but that platforms, that often does not violate platform policies, I often use the example of fear speech. And so, there's often a lot of talk of hate speech, but there's actually a PNS study by a professor at Rutgers where he goes and looks for hate speech online, and a lot of what he finds is fear speech. And fear speech takes the form, this is actually from like the George Floyd protests. And if you remember at the time, there was a lot of talk online about there are people coming to protest, and some number of these protesters are members of Antifa, and so you need to show up and protect yourself against these protesters who are dangerous people. And obviously, some people did show up armed to protect their communities against these people, and actually, some number of people were killed as a result of the resulting conflict. Now, obviously, this is misleading. Most protesters are not members of Antifa, but it's hard to tell people what they can or cannot be afraid of, and you also can't prove that no person who's coming to your town has ever been to an Antifa meeting, right? It's hard to actually tell people what they can or cannot be afraid of ahead of time. In other countries, it shows up, it's kind of like this article on the right, that 20,000, that a Muslim pharmacy owner is trying to sterilize the Buddhist community. Internationally, there's a common thing that often will spread is just this idea that you have to watch out and take care of your children because there are people who are coming to your community and are going to harm your children. Seems like a reasonable thing that you'd want to forward to your friends, right? Like if there's a threat to your children, you're going to want to forward it on, and many people do. And then people show up innocently talking to children in the community, and then they are attacked and violence ensues. So these things, but the problem is you can't tell people that no one, I can't prove to you that there is no threat to the children in your community, right? Like these things that people are afraid of, it's not unreasonable for them to be afraid of them, and it's hard to prove that these things are actually problematic ahead of time. And if you ask users about their experiences, you can actually see them tell you that they're seeing, they can actually tell that a lot of these kinds of content are actually problematic, right? So this is from the Facebook papers. You can see around the George Floyd protests, there was a spike in the number of users who said that they are seeing content that they think could lead to violence in their community. And so you see, it's over 15% of users are saying they're seeing this kind of content that, you have to show up and defend your community. And that's in stark contrast to the violence incitement numbers that platforms will often report. Similarly, in the kids welfare space, right? Users will tell you that, 11% of them report being a target of bullying and harassment, whereas the violating content numbers will often tell a very different story. And I used to show this graph internally, and I've shown it many times externally. This is actually from the Dangerous Speech Project. And it basically tells you something you already know, that what makes something harmful is not just about what people are saying. So it's not just about the message, about, is it hate speech or not hate speech, but it's about the context in which it is said, right? So if I'm someone who reports a crime about an immigrant, if I'm someone who reports a crime that is committed by an immigrant, it could just be a news story, right? I could just be talking about a crime that happened. But if I'm someone who has a history of talking about crime committed by immigrants, and I'm talking to a community that is already predisposed to dislike immigrants and be afraid of immigrants, then that is a very different context in which to be spreading those kinds of messages, right? I'm painting a very particular kinds of story, and then recently in the UK you saw the result of that kind of dynamic, where a story about a crime committed, and there are people of all groups who commit crimes, right? So it's easy to cherry pick a crime committed by a group and talk about it in a particular way, and create a context which actually makes something that would otherwise be benign make it more harmful. When you focus on what people are saying, you also often get issues of censorship and bias. And so this is actually a post from not the current Israel-Palestine conflict, but actually the previous one. So, it's one. There are places in the world where it's actually very reasonable to feel fear for the other side. If you're in Israel, or if you're in Palestine, if you're in Ukraine, it's very reasonable to talk about your fears of conflict. In a lot of these places, you also, the other thing you might do is make a list of all the things you can or can't do in a particular area. So ChatGPT, for example, famously had a set of content a list of figures that you could not make fun of. They included many Christian religious figures. They did not include many Hindu religious figures. And as a result, they were accused of anti-Hindu bias. And so you could think, well, why don't we just include all the kinds of religious figures that could potentially be harmful to make fun of? But no list will ever be perfect, right? So what did we do? We eventually moved away from design solutions. We eventually moved away from content moderation, from attempting to decide what kinds of content people could or could not say online, and we moved to design. And why? Because design solutions are inherently more legitimate and defensible. They remove human judgment and subjectivity from the equation, and they're more effective because they can get at these kinds of borderline content, this kind of fear speech that are hard to get at in other ways. These are often referred to as like the break the glass measures that you'll often hear platforms talk about working on in crises. What do these design changes look like? So a lot of things that platforms do often in these crisis settings is, again, removing engagement incentives. So removing comments, removing shares. Again, I mentioned how if you remove the incentive for people to spread content that gets more comments and gets more shares, you get less bullying, less harassment. You get people saying that content's more worth their time, and you get less anger reactions. What do you replace it with? So instead of optimizing, so one thing I worked on was comment ranking. And so if I were to go to a thread of a popular post and I were to say like, F you, politician, I'd probably get a lot of positive feedback, a lot of engagement. So some people would like what I said. Some people might argue with me about what I said. But regardless, I get a lot of engagement. So if you're optimizing for replies or if you're optimizing for likes, that sort of F you politician content would actually go high in terms of comment ranking. Alternatively, you can optimize for surveys and ask people whether a particular comment is high or low quality. And so if you do that, people don't think that F you politician is actually a high quality comment. They think it's a relatively low quality comment. And so you'll actually get a very different kind of comment ranking experience, right? So instead of optimizing for engagement, what kind of content gets more replies, what kind of content gets more likes, you can instead optimize for what kind of content people think is higher quality, and you can actually get a better experience. You can only survey people so much before they get tired, so sometimes you can add these kinds of aspirational preferences to the user experience itself. Facebook has experimented with this show more, show less interface, right? So like not did I pay attention to that piece of content, but do I actually want to see more of that kind of content? Or do I want to see less of that kind of content? And so if people are seeing unwanted sexual content, overly sensational content, they might say, I want to see less of that, and I want to see more, say, educational content. Another thing that you can add into the user experience is, so a lot of platforms are sort of it makes it really easy to tell an algorithm that I want something, and they make it really hard for you to tell an algorithm that I don't want something, right? So like, even if, if I write, F you politician, most people might think that's like a terrible comment or a terrible piece of content, but it's hard for people to tell the algorithm that, you have to go into the 3-dot menu and report it or hide it. If you just make it a little bit easier for people to say that that was actually a bad comment, you actually get a signal that you can use in your algorithm. So one thing we did is we added this X on the upper right of some number of Facebook posts. And that X allows people to more easily say, I dislike that piece of content, I want to hide it. And you can use that in algorithms to improve the user experience. And the last kind of design change that often was used was rate and functionality limiting. So around January 6th, it was a tiny group of people who invited tons of people to the Stop the Steal groups. One intervention that occurred was just simply to reduce the limit on how many people can you invite to groups in a given week or in a given day. You can also put limits on the amount of times people can forward content, right? So you can still share content, but maybe you, after the 5th time you forward it, you have to cut and paste it and forward it in a more manual way. Or putting limits on what kinds of, how many times people can access other people's profiles, right? So in some countries, we make it really easy for people to be private, and so people can't access your information. And so just these ways to add friction to the system, whether it's friction on inviting people to groups, it's friction on forwarding content, or it's friction on accessing people's profiles. These are ways that we add more safety or better experiences to an ecosystem. So since leaving Meta, I've worked with, I've talked to people at various other companies. A lot of my colleagues now work at various other platforms. And a lot of platforms, it's not just, these aren't things that are just done at Meta. These are things that if you look at the announcements that have been made across many tech platforms, they often are sort of reducing the ability of other users to contact people they don't know. They talk about using surveys. So YouTube's done this a lot. They take, rather than optimizing for engagement, they will optimize for surveys. They will give people more control over their algorithm. They will add more rate limits so that small groups of people can't manipulate others. Usually all harms, whether it's harms to kids or harms to elections and democracy, are perpetrated by small groups of people. Small groups of people are the ones who perpetrate misinformation. Small groups of people are the people who attempt to bully others or troll comment spaces. And so if you add rate limits, and more ability for other users to indicate, the ones who are causing issues in his system, you get more abilities of people to, more user empowerment, more ability for people to control the outcomes of their space, and you get less ability of small groups of users to manipulate others, and better outcomes for children and for elections and democracy. And an example of what this looks like, so there's a paper we wrote about non-engagement. It's in the upper right. And across platforms, not just at Meta, there are algorithms that optimize for some combination of observed behavior and expressed aspiration. So an example I often use is, platforms often defend themselves against the idea that there's a problem online by saying that they just give people what they want. But there's really two kinds of wants, right? Like if you asked me and you were to give me a donut today, I would probably eat a donut, right? Like so there's some part of me that always wants a donut, right? But I don't aspire to eat more donuts. I aspire to eat healthier. So my observed behavior is in some ways different than my aspiration. And that's true across a number of domains, right? So my observed behavior in the health domain, right? Like I often eat unhealthy food, but I want to eat healthier food. And if you show up at my house at 3 a.m. with donuts constantly, I won't think you're doing me a service. I will actually think you're doing me a disservice, right? And that's also true as far as like the usage of my phone. Like I have 3 kids. I often, spend time on my phone when I should be paying attention to my kids. I'd rather spend less time on my phone and more time playing outside. But unfortunately, I do spend some amount of time on my phone when I could be doing other things. I consume content that maybe is more sensational than I'd like it to be. I'd rather be reading, longer form documentaries and longer form articles. And so there's always this disconnect between observed behavior and expressed aspirations. And algorithms can also look and optimize for either observed behavior or aspirations, right? So on the right are things that algorithms can optimize for, things like view time, clicks, comments. These are behaviors, right? You're not saying I want that more of that content. You're just saying I paid attention to it. I'm consuming that piece of content. On the left are things like surveys, right? Or an upvote or a love reaction, where there's a little bit more of a desire component to your action. I'm actually saying I want that piece of content. I'm saying like I think that piece of content is worth my time. I think that piece of content is something that I want more of, right? So I put this on a spectrum intentionally. It's not like anything is purely observed behavior or anything is purely aspiration, but there are things that are more in the observed behavior realm, things like time spent viewing something, and there are things in the more aspirational realm, things like surveys. And so the more we can move algorithms towards these surveys, the more we give people more control over these systems, and the more we have data, some of the data which I showed you as far as like removing comments and shares from models to show that these lead to better outcomes, both in terms of the kids' well-being and the democracy space. So this is the kind of thing that we've been advocating for, really replacing engagement optimization with more user controls, right? More what do people aspire to consume as opposed to what are people paying attention to. And we hope to address this idea, this ecosystem level issue, where publishers and politicians are saying that they're incentivized to produce more polarizing content, or influencers are saying that they are incentivized to produce more extreme or more sexual content. Right? We're trying to address this at a more ecosystem level rather than deciding individually what people are allowed to say or not say. Since I've been out since Meta about 2 years, I'm not the only one who's been doing this. There's a lot of other people who I think have come to similar realizations. We've been working with some people at Pinterest. Wrote this paper, What We Know About Non-Engagement Signals and Content Ranking, along with people from LinkedIn and Pinterest. And we actually had contributions from a lot of other companies, people who couldn't contribute to this paper. And we're seeing that some platforms are actually moving more in this direction, right? They're trying to, and so Facebook has said that they are moving more towards user surveys, and they've deprecated comments and surveys from their models. And we're starting to see more platforms see how they can figure out how to optimize for people's aspirational selves as opposed to their lizard brain selves. We're also seeing policymakers start to address these issues, right? So, in New York and California, they've passed some version of the Stop Addictive Feeds Act. It's not exactly how I would write a piece of legislation, but it's a start in terms of trying to address some of these algorithmic issues and trying to reduce the harms that are relevant to engagement-based algorithms. You also see the EU start to question these algorithms, try to understand what is going into them. Hopefully, we can push them to, not just turn off algorithms, but maybe push them in a way that they understand that aspirational ingredients to algorithms are better than these more attention-based ingredients. And then, I also work a little bit with Ofcom in the UK. One part of their guidance for protecting minors online is that children should also be allowed to provide negative feedback directly to the recommender system. So this idea that we need to be able to give people more control over the recommender experience, including the ability to give negative feedback, is something that we're increasingly seeing across jurisdictions. We've made some progress in terms of policy here. So if you're interested in some of the deeper research here, you can read a report that we wrote for the Minnesota Attorney General about the effects of technology on youth well-being. Again, in this, we don't talk about the overall effect on mental health of social media. Instead, we talk about the specific design patterns that platforms have and how they specifically lead to bad experiences on these platforms. And then, with colleagues, we've started reviewing all the legislation across jurisdictions and tried to figure out what are the kinds of things that people are concerned about and how do we map them to the specific design affordances of platforms. And looking at that, there really are 4 categories of harm that people talk about. There's unwanted usage of platforms, like people are using these platforms instead of sleep or instead of their studies. People are seeing content they don't want to see. They're having unwanted sexual content or disturbing content, graphic content. They're getting contact that they don't want. They might be getting unwanted advances. And then people are using their information in ways that they don't appreciate. So, and for all of these, there are design affordances that contribute to these kinds of harms. For example, unwanted contact is often a result of lax rate limits, right? If you let anyone contact anyone as much as they want, you are going to get people in other countries who bomb, teenagers with solicitations pretending to be attractive strangers, which is what, the playbook in many places is, right? If you have engagement-based algorithms, you optimize for what people pay attention to, then you're going to get a lot of sexual content in people's feed. Even if you try to remove that content, people are going to be sexual in other ways, right? Maybe they won't be nude, but they will try to be shocking or explicit in some other way, right? So there are lots of ways where the specific design patterns of platforms, and it's not just social media. These kinds of design patterns can exist. You could have a video game platform that allows anyone to contact anyone as many times as they want, right? It's the same kind of mechanism for leading to a lot of unwanted contact from strangers. So that's a lot about how we could fix the problem. How would we know if we actually made progress? So I've referred to, the answer is probably implicit in a lot of what I've already said. Meta's beef survey I've talked about already. Is something that gives you a glimpse of what is possible, right? If the number of if 19% of 13 to 15-year-olds are seeing unwanted sexual content, and that is something that you can address far easier than, say, the broader impact of social media on mental health, right? It's a lot more actionable in terms of an algorithm. And fortunately, you don't have to be at a platform to ask users about their experiences with these kinds of positive and negative experiences. We've actually been doing this recently. At USC, we have a panel at the Center for Economic and Social Research. It's a representative panel of the population, household-based probability sample. And we've used some of the same questions that have been used at platforms. So, Facebook, for example, asked users what content was good or bad for the world, and sort of helped validate that question actually gets at a lot of content that other people perceive to be problematic. So, and when we ask users in society, so externally, the same kinds of questions that we ask, that Meta asked internally, you get patterns that are reasonably representative of what you might think. So, for example, on Facebook and Twitter, you see a lot more content that people consider bad for the world than you do on platforms like LinkedIn, or even you might consider like neutral technologies like email or text messaging, right? Like, why are we seeing a lot more? There are going to be bad things that happen online. And so the amount of content that's bad for the world that you should see shouldn't be zero. But why are we seeing a lot more content that's bad for the world on platforms which have algorithms and engagement-based feeds than we are on platforms where people are more selecting the kinds of things that they're seeing? If you ask people where they've witnessed or experienced something that affected them negatively, you see a lot more of that also on places like Facebook and Twitter, and you see a lot less of it on places like LinkedIn, Pinterest, other places that maybe have different norms. And then you can not just ask about negative experiences, you can also ask about positive experiences. So we can ask, why do people use social media? There's oftentimes people talk about they want to learn new things, they want to connect with other people. And so you can see what are the platforms where people learn new things. The fact that people have some number of negative experiences on YouTube, I think about it very differently in a world where almost half of people who use YouTube report actually having learned something new or useful or important within a 28-day period. Similarly for like meaningful connection, right? Like Facebook actually does really well, pretty well relative to other platforms in terms of connection, right? So if we can start to understand like what are the positive experiences that people have, what are the design affordances that lead to more positive experiences, what are the design affordances to lead to more negative experiences, and try to push platforms in one direction versus the other, I think we can start to make progress on the problems of social media. We can also ask questions about like long-term outcomes. So we don't just ask people what their experiences are, but we also ask users about their feelings of loneliness, about their feelings of anxiety, their feelings of depression. We can look at that over time and see what kinds of experiences are predictive of these other outcomes of interest to society. I found like graphing platforms as far as what percentage of users are lonely and what percentage of users are feeling a meaningful connection actually leads to some interesting insights. You have these platforms where people have more experiences of meaningful connection and where users report being less lonely. And you have these platforms which are more the traditional social media platforms where people are more lonely and they report fewer experiences of meaningful connection. Now, I can't tell you where the directionality lies. Like people may be using these platforms because they feel lonely, or they could be becoming more lonely as a result of these platforms. But as we look at these, as we start to do these surveys over time, we can start to answer these questions, at least longitudinally, where the directionality lies. And so we've been starting to show these kinds of findings to people within both industry and within policymakers. We've been showing this data to people at Nextdoor, for example. Nextdoor actually did, in our original surveys, there was a lot of people reporting they were having a lot of negative experiences online. There was some people at Nextdoor who took that internally and tried to use that to, in concert with some internal data they had, and made an argument to change some of the dynamics of their product to hopefully make it better. So people are, and I did this too when I worked at a platform. Like it's great to have data from the external world that helps you make the arguments that you want to make to improve your product. Conversely, there are people at Pinterest who've been using the product, using our surveys to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of their product. A lot of people learn new things on Pinterest. People don't necessarily connect a great deal. Pinterest isn't necessarily designed to connect people. It's really more designed for people to learn new things. And so it was sort of more in keeping with the idea that there's external data helping them get to the place that they already thought they were going. Finally, you can also do this, not just for platforms that are already popular, but you can start to do this for platforms that are starting to become popular. So we've also started doing this with AI, starting to understand what are people's experiences with, say, generative AI. This is actually fairly old data. We did this, over a year ago, and at the time, only about 16% of people reported using AI products. Most of the people were using them out of curiosity. They generally reported more utility than harm with these products. So, but now, there have been a lot more usage of these products. So, in our original survey, only 16% of people had reported using these products at all. In more recent data, and this is not our data, but we're actually in the field now trying to collect new data. But in more recent data, you can see that the amount of people, even just for chatbots alone, 24% of teens report using chatbots at least several times per week, right? Either daily or several times per week. So already we're seeing a lot more growth of these products, and we're starting to see a lot more bad experiences as a result of these products. There's the notable suicide of a person who was had a romantic relationship with a character AI bot. And as more and more people start to use these products less out of curiosity and more for mental health or social connection, we can start to track these people using these products and whether we're starting to see more negative experiences with them. So that was what I hope to communicate today. Specifically, there is a problem with online platforms. There are specific platform designs that cause polarizing and mentally disturbing experiences for many people. I hopefully have given you some examples of some of the design changes that you can make to fix these problems, and that you can use user experience measurement to hopefully understand what kinds of problems exist and hopefully also see when these things get better. So, all right, thank you for your time.
All right, well, we picked a pretty great day for you to come here. Obviously, you heard about the meta news earlier today.
Yep.
Already have multiple questions from the audience. Bruce and Roger have asked if you would be willing to give your take on the changes that Meta announced around no more fact-checking, the movement of the trust and safety teams from California to Texas. Just wondering how you would think about that from your kind of design and feature-based approach.
Yeah, I don't. So I worry. There are a lot of great organizations that do fact checking, and so I think I worry about the support for those organizations. And fact checking is great in terms of when you're trying to understand a design change. If you were trying to understand, what leads to people to see more or less trustworthy content, then fact checking is a great metric. But fact checking doesn't really scale in the sense that the amount of content that actually gets fact-checked is a tiny percentage, even in English, right? And in other countries, it's a tiny percent even still. There's a lot of content that's more misleading that will never get fact-checked. There's lots of ways to mislead people. So a lot of the ways that people mislead people they're just asking leading questions or they're telling stories, and they're not necessarily things that are fact-checkable. So I think fact-checking itself is not necessarily as effective as the existence of fact-checking sort of leads you to believe. And so I'm sad for the organizations, and I'm sad for the metric that it provided, but I don't think fact checking was ever a sustainable way for us to make these ecosystems more, make trustworthy content more prevalent on these ecosystems, and so therefore, it's understandable. It's not. Fact checkers do good work. Like every small amount of content that you can address, that you can make less prevalent, or you can help correct. I'm not saying that's not important, but in the grand scheme of things, it probably was not a broad solution to these problems.
Can you think of another design or code kind of approach to trustworthiness that you would sort of encourage now that fact checking is not going to be one of the?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read exactly where what happened with this, but the biggest thing that platforms have done around reducing misinformation, and the reason why it's one of the break the glass measures that you see platforms do constantly over and over again, is removing engagement-based incentives. Or, misinformation is also often driven by a tiny group of people. So it's also doing something around reputation or negative feedback or negative signal. So those are the kinds of things that more sustainably change an ecosystem. If you actually thought about why don't we lie to each other here in this room? It's not because the police are going to come and take me away if I lie. It's actually because we have a reputation to uphold. If I were to lie to you, you would find out about it. You wouldn't invite me back. There's a social cost to lying to people. There's a reputational cost, and you want to be seen as trustworthy, right? And so those are the kinds of things that actually drive. And there's an ecosystem code version of that, right? Instead of optimizing for how many followers I can get or how much time I can take out of people's day, optimizing for how many people trust you is a closer to the analog of you having an incentive to actually say trustworthy things. So in code, kind of what I showed earlier about going towards aspirational, giving people the ability to give negative feedback, giving people the ability to say who they trust, as opposed to anchoring on, who is able to get more attention or more followers online. That's the way you actually create an ecosystem that is more trustworthy.
Great. Thank you. I'll open it up to the floor. So if people have any questions, you can start thinking of them now. Yeah, right over here.
Michael Siegel. I just wanted to ask you, when listening to it, I guess I have a question about when do you know you're doing something wrong, or when are you influencing things where you are being, yourself are making decisions about influence? Maybe let me describe with an example. My mother, before she passed away, when she was elderly, she loved forwarding those messages on. It made her day for some reason. I would talk to her all the time and say, don't do that, so on, but she loved it. She loved it. So the design decision to make that type of thing not as common would have affected my mother's day. And though that's maybe not the most important thing, you've made a design decision to affect a community and perhaps take something away from somebody. How do you know when you're doing that? How do you make decisions about doing that? And the power of these design decisions are fairly large compared to the individual's activity. So I guess comment on that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, every action has there is no perfect design decision, right? So I'm sure there are people who love things being forwarded on. I'm sure there's content that gets lots of comments back and forth that's amazing, and there's an amazing conversation that's being missed as a result, right? There's always some consequence to everything you do. And I think we just have to accept that, or else we live in a world where we try to, in a much more heavy-handed way, decide okay, well, that's a good conversation and that's a bad conversation. And that you have to do things that are just in the direction of tilting the playing field towards trustworthy content, or tilting the playing field towards better experiences, as opposed to, trying to cherry pick what individual people can and can't do. Or else you get yourself in a world where you really are, I think, and platforms have made mistakes in this realm all the time. You really are kind of picking winners and losers. I think you have a responsibility as an online platform to tilt the playing field towards to encourage better things versus worse things. One thing I often say is like, I often make the analogy to a building code. Like, platforms aren't responsible because bad things happen online. I think they're responsible when they encourage bad things to happen. And so some number of bad things are going to happen regardless of any design decision. People are going to get inflammatory misinformation, or maybe people are going to miss out on being able to forward something that was important to them. Something bad is going to happen, but I think what you want to do is design a system that doesn't encourage those things to happen as much as you can. And so, yes, maybe some number of people enjoy forwarding things a lot, but I think you kind of have to weigh the good with the bad and see, like, well, what do you care more about, right? Like the fact that maybe you can give people a different way to do the thing that your mother was appreciating. Like, maybe there's another. Like, I think one other reason why a lot of these systems have sort of these people who want to spread certain kinds of messages is because we don't have in society a way for, we're kind of disconnected as a society. And so the way that some number of people, I'm not saying this is true for your mother, but the way that some number of people, try to feel a sense of connection in society is to, to go online and try to be part of a community and try to kind of get a sense of purpose online. And sometimes that sense of purpose is positive and sometimes that sense of purpose is negative. If we can give people other ways to fulfill that sense of purpose, I think we'd see a lot less of the problems we see online.
Thanks. I had a question about the legislation that you had mentioned that's misguided, the sort of anti-addictive feed legislation. And you had said, if I were to design, that wouldn't be how I would design something. Can you talk about how you might design something that would encourage platforms that are sort of less likely to heed this advice to change their design?
Yeah. So to be clear, I support that legislation. I think that it could be written differently. And so a lot of those Stop Addictive Feed Acts address personalization. So they basically say you cannot use someone's data if they're a minor to create a feed, an addictive feed. And then there's an exception, unless you, and then some of the exceptions are you're addressing like something that they search for, or if you do a chronological feed. I think most specifically, I would change the chronological feed exception and try to expand on ways that you address aspirational preferences. So, and it's tricky because once you start talking about aspirational preferences, you kind of get into like editorial decisions that have First Amendment implications. So, it's kind of a tricky way to actually frame it. But ideally, the end goal would be to serve people's aspirational preferences as opposed to their sort of like attention preferences. And as written, I think the focus on chronological feed is not helpful because a lot of times chronological feed emphasizes like the people who are just most active, who often are like the worst people. So the more you can sort of alter that, instead of like the alternative being chronological feed, the alternative is aspirational feed. That would be like the way I would change it. So I think I think they have the right problem identified, but I think the solution ideally would be tweaked slightly away from chronological feed and towards sort of aspirational feed.
And then maybe the second part of the question about a carrot or a stick for platforms that are less likely to heed, I guess, how would you encourage people to comply, right? If in the meantime, or as the legislation is making its way through, right? How do we whether carrot or stick?
I mean, there are fines that people, like a lot of these, there are, Yeah, so I mean, like, there's the sticks are the standard sticks that platforms have or that government has. The carrot, some people also talk about Section 230 protections being contingent on them. I guess that's kind of a stick because they already have them, but like you could think of it as a carrot. Like you get to keep your protections if you engage in these kinds of things, and that's a strategy that some people have thought about.
One in the back there. Or Will?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so happy that you have worked with Meta, and finally I can meet someone because I was at Facebook and I could never find someone to talk with. I realized that Meta, Facebook mostly that I use, cover stuff that is happening about women in Middle East and in Iran. And doesn't let people really realize about the biggest apartheid that is happening right now, that 1 billion people are counted as half person, the biggest apartheid of the human history. And then when someone, because my field is the Islam, I do research about Islam, and when I do some comments, I get banned all the time for 1 week, for 3 days, for 1 month, and there is no way to converse with someone because these are the facts that I am talking about, and there is no way. I have never got a positive, like I request and I never get the things. I go there, nobody is there. How does it work? This is a truth is happening in the Middle East about 1 billion women. And most of the people don't know in the Western world. How does it work and how can I really do something about that?
I mean, I'd just say, so I can't really comment on like that specific content or the thing that you're saying. I don't have good knowledge of that. I guess the one thing I can say is that it's a fairly common experience that people talk about something that they feel passionate about, unfortunately, and they run afoul of these moderation rules, right? Because when you speak forcefully about a thing, you naturally speak in a language that AI or some system is going to think is, you speak with stronger words. You speak about other people, and all of a sudden you've fallen afoul of some policy, or an AI thinks you've fallen afoul of some policy. And so that's one reason why I don't love moderation as a tool that you reach for first to make systems better, because you're always going to make those kinds of mistakes, and you're often going to make those kinds of mistakes in the most important situations, right? You're going to make it for people who feel really passionate about a thing, and you see in this backlash against platforms because they enforce on people who feel really passionate about a thing, and people should be able to express themselves when they feel really passionate about a thing. So my hope is that if we lean less into moderation as a way to make platforms better and more into design, that those kinds of experience won't happen that happen to you.
One last one from online, Ravi. Michael from the Carnegie Foundation was just asking about ID and reputation, so maybe related to your trust point, but also as the Australians and other countries start to put age restrictions in, being able to ID people is going to be really important. Do you have any thoughts on progress on that front, or why there's been any lack of progress?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've been helping push, and this was actually in John Haidt's book, is the idea of device-based verification. So I think that it's whatever you think about age verification, it would be better if it were done less versus done more, right? There's always going to be some risk of trying to identify people, and so if I have 3 kids myself, if I could somehow just identify that this device was owned by a 12-year-old, I think that would help solve a lot of the problem. It won't solve all of the problem, but it'll solve a lot of the problem. So I think there are ways that we can get around some of these problems around like who is old enough, or who are, if we could somehow, get the help of Apple and Google in the world to help us manage our identities at the device level instead of at the app level.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's going to be a lot of Australian adults that are surprised and annoyed at how often they're about to get asked about their age. Before I thank Ravi, let me just say Jeremy Bailenson will be joining us next week to give us the sort of landscape of VR and AR. So please join us next week. And please join me in thanking Ravi one more time for his thoughts. Thank you so much.